Okay, good evening everybody, and a very warm welcome to this webinar. This is part of the Farm Advisory Service Sustainable Beef Systems project. And tonight is webinar 1. We're looking at, the title this year is The Cow of the Future, and today's webinar is about where are we now. So we know there's lots of changing policy and there's lots of information flying about, and today's really just about trying to pull it together, see where we're at, and see where we're working from. So we've got a really good panel of speakers tonight. So as I said, this is the Sustainable Beef Systems Sustainable Beef Systems series. So last year we did the same, a series of webinars focusing on key periods through the year, outwintering strategies, weaning, health planning, grazing strategies, and fertility were the 5 topics we covered. It's really useful webinars there available on the YouTube channel, and we can certainly send those links out and links out to you, or you'll get them through on the Farm Advisory Service as well. So that's last year, but we're now on to this year, Series 2. Sometimes the sequel's not as good as the original. This time, the sequel's definitely better. So we kicked off yesterday with an on-farm event at Easter Howgate, which is our SRUC's research farm. So we looked at the system there, the research, the pretty high-end research at the Green Cow facility, so the methane chambers, and then we looked at the Green Shed, which is a new facility that's been built, which is like a large-scale methane chamber. And then, so that really set the scene in terms of the science, where we're at. And then from then on, we discussed basically the bit that really matters, the fertility, survival and growth story, and the financial story that really is why we're all here. And that the take-home message really from yesterday is that the carbon story and the science that's happening is, there's a lot of quite exciting stuff happening out there, but the key bit at farm level is to focus on efficiency and make sure that we're making more money than we were before. Do anything we can to maximise that level of profit. And ultimately, the sustainable part of sustainable beef systems is not entirely about carbon. So today, we're going to hear a fair bit about carbon, but I'd like you to keep that in mind, that we're not just focusing solely on the carbon bit. We're looking, at the broader, to be sustainable, we need to obviously do the carbon thing. We need to do the biodiversity thing. We need to do the profit thing. We need to do succession. There's a whole load of parts to sustainability that we all need to consider on our own farms. So that's my wee sermon. But for tonight, we've got the where are we now question, and we've got 2 really esteemed speakers, actually. So 2 professors, one Professor Stephen Thomson, who will probably not be a stranger to many of you. Many of you will have heard Stevie speak in the past. So Stevie is our senior agricultural economist and policy advisor. So we'll hear from Stephen first, and then after that, I don't think Stephen will mind me saying that we've probably got the main event, which is Professor Jude Capper, who's a livestock sustainability consultant, and she's also a chair of sustainable beef and sheep production at Harper Adams, which is I suppose as an SEC employee, it's important to say there's other educational establishments are available. So it's good to have someone from Harper here as well. So I think without any further ado, I'll just stop sharing here and introduce Stephen Thomson.
Thanks, Robert, and good evening, everybody. I get the wonderful joy of talking about agricultural policy, and the key message here is don't shoot the messenger. Quite often I think I get blamed for agricultural policy in Scotland and the decisions that Scottish Government ministers are taking, but simply I'm involved in the loop on giving advice and giving data analytics to them to make decisions. I suppose the starting point, and this is a key message, and I think it's a key message that ministers and policy officials need to better understand, is that agricultural support across Scotland, and this isn't just beef farms, this is all farms within the Farm Business Survey, so it's 500 odd farms or 450 farms that we've got data on, where the accounts are done by the college that feed into the government system. And when you strip out the support payments, the blue bars, The red bars are where your farm business income, your profitability of these farms sits. And the black line is where with support farms profitability sits. And you can see there's the typical S-curve. We've currently got about 20% of the farms making losses without direct support plus LFA payments. If you strip out the support payments, then 65% lose money just now without that direct support payment. And again, I think it was good that Robert mentioned the sort of the efficiency side of things. And I mean, the key for me is what have you got within your control? And the thing you don't have control over just now is the market price. And there's limited control you have over what agricultural policy is coming down the track. But you do have control over your cost basis, and the decisions you make on the farm affect those efficiencies. The policy awareness matrix is important to kind of understand, and the way I think about it these days is the Donald Rumsfeld syndrome, which is what are the known knowns, what are the unknown knowns, the known unknowns, etc. And the way we can think about that, and we can think about that in the terms of the Scottish Suckler Beef Support Scheme. If we think about known knowns, well, we now know that there is a 410-day calving interval condition coming from 2025. We all should know that now. We're all at different parts. We all have different understanding of this matrix. The unknown knowns, we know that the scheme is going to continue to 28, but we don't know what the calving interval threshold looks like in 2027. There was some discussions that I was aware of looking and seeing what 405 days might look like, but the minister made a commitment at the NFUS conference to static 410 days for 25 on 26. If you think about the known unknowns, we know that this is a known unknown. We don't know what happens post 28 for SSBSS. We know there's a commitment by the Cabinet Secretary to supporting coupled support till 2028, but we don't know what happens thereafter. And if it happens thereafter, we don't know what the budget allocation looks like. And then the unknown unknowns are what other conditions might be placed on the beef calf scheme or the beef scheme. And I have been involved in various different groups where we've been looking at different metrics from the cattle tracing system data, which I'll come back to in a minute. And the key for me is that some of this has changed in the last month. We used to know what the budget allocation was for agriculture under the previous CAP regime. We used to know what it was. There was a guarantee or a promise under the previous government. Now the ring fence budget, the ring fence for agriculture has been removed for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So we now are in the realms of how do we support and make sure that the Parliament understands, the Scottish Parliament understand the need to support the sector. The general policy developments, the top line graphic is the reduction in the buying power that the government are faced with. So with agricultural inflation running at extraordinary levels in the last few years, that buying power is falling off a cliff face. So if you look back to 2002, the rough budget, the 21 budget would have bought 900 million quid's worth of inputs. Currently, it's probably buying 350 million quid's worth of inputs in 2021 prices. So the buying power of the government is falling rapidly because of inflation, which means you as farmers are having to derive more and more of your profit from the market. And that means that there is increasing focus on the technical efficiency of your herds, and what you can do to cut costs is vital. We know that the calving interval condition is coming. We also know, and hopefully people understand, that there's a new peatland and wetland maintenance component to the cross compliance that's being introduced. That should say from 2025. It is from 2025. There's a new piece of legislation. It's a statutory instrument that's in draft form. It's not in front of committee yet, that puts this in place in legislative terms. I was expecting to see something there on whole farm plans, but there isn't. So my understanding is there is no legislative basis for the whole farm plans unless unless there's new legislation further down the tracks that's put in. And I'm unsure if they're going to do that. So I'm not sure what the status of whole farm planning is because of this piece of legislation. We know enhanced conditionality is being talked about in the second tier of the new framework. And the discussions to date have been about extending the ecological focus area principle. And the discussions I've been aware of, and they're not confidential, have been extending arable areas, ecological focus area, if you have to meet that requirement, extending it to 7%. But more importantly for the beef sector is the potential dropping of the grassland, grassland derogations, where you do not have to do ecological focus area on your cropping area and your temporary grassland if you've got more than 15 hectares. So that is a potential change that would be coming in 2026 that people are talking about. There's an ongoing review of the regions. Are they fit for purpose going forward? There's a lot of discussion that we should potentially merge the two rough grazing regions or the two, Region 2 and Region 3. If you're asking people to do environmental conditionality, I think, and my opinion is that we should end up with a cropping or a rotational region, a permanent grassland region, and a rough grazing region, because it simplifies everything in terms of what the government may be asking people to do. And then the future of LFA support, I'm not really sure if the discussions have even started on that. We hear calls for rebasing quite often. I've looked at some of the numbers. I'm not convinced people really want rebasing because it will change your grazing category. It may change your uplifts. It may change quite a lot of things in terms of LFA payments if we actually were to rebase and do a full rebasing exercise. In terms of, I get asked this question an awful lot, is why calving interval? And I suppose going all the way back to the Suckler Beef Climate Group that Jim Walker chaired, there was a lot of discussion about what we could do or what the industry could do to make improvements. And you always you end up coming around to, well, what can we actually monitor and measure? Well, we can measure heifer calving age, we can measure the slaughter age of animals, we can measure calving intervals, and we can potentially measure carbon footprints by doing carbon audits of farms. All of them come with issues. All of them have potential measuring issues, and all of them have rational discussions as to why it shouldn't happen for certain areas, certain breeds, certain sizes of farms. And you can take heifer calving age. I'm in lots of discussions where people are talking about 24-month heifer calving age, and some people are aghast at that, and some people are saying, well, this breed it doesn't work with. If you think about the slaughter age, then stratified systems are difficult. Who is responsible for getting the calf to slaughter by whatever the threshold is? And you're seeing that coming in the private sector. So Morrison's have made noises about 21-month slaughter age, etc. The government's perspectives have changed, societal perspectives have changed, and there is a call, particularly from environmental NGOs, for more to be derived out of the beef payments, simply because of the enteric methane that cattle produce, and also the fact that suckler herd accounts for over 40% of agricultural emissions. Now, I will caveat that the agricultural emissions, the way it's done, doesn't account for the sequestration of in grassland that appears in what's called the LULUCF, the land use change in forestry inventory. But even when you take that into consideration, there's still elements of that LULUCF inventory in terms of arable crops that come into the beef sector in terms of feed that need to be accounted for. So it's a really, really complex picture that I'm not convinced anybody has really bottomed out. And I suppose the key here is that the advice was that I think calving interval is the simplest of conditions to place on farms, even though there's a lot of contention about what the thresholds should be and whether or not there should be any threshold. I've done a series of evidence based on the cattle tracing system data, where basically getting into the movements data from everybody, and I've now got it from 2015 to 2023, where you can see the general trends. You can look at this at a cow level, at a calf level, at a holding level, at a business level, at a geographical spatial level, etc. And there's a whole series of stuff, including all the presentations I do, which are now in that link that you can go and have a look at. The key for me is that there are spatial and system variations and scale variations that I'm not convinced we're fully acknowledging, or policy are fully acknowledging. So if we look at the calving date, we can see that the islands have a different profile. The graphic there is the proportion of, or the proportion of calves that are born each in 2023. And that's just by the mainland SSBSS scheme and the islands SSBSS scheme. And we can see also that there's been significant improvement over the years that I've got data in terms of the mean and the median. So the average, the mean, has dropped from over 402 days on the mainland in 2019. 2019, remember, is a legacy of the beast from the east, and it's dropped down to 391. And on the islands, it's dropped from 403 days in 2016 to 391 days again in 2023. Improvements have been made in the sector. I'm not convinced that that has been acknowledged in terms of policy. And I suppose the key message for everybody is, where do you sit within that profile? And I suppose you can go and look at My Herd stats and see how your herd is performing. Something I've been doing recently, and nobody's really seen this other than a select few of stakeholders, is because I keep getting asked about how cows perform from one year to the next year, or how a farm performs one year to the next year. And we can see significant improvements, and this explains why the mean and the median are falling in terms of the calving interval. The numbers on the way to read this is, read along the way. That's what an animal was doing in 2015 or 2022, and read down the year after. It tells you. So in 2015, there was 6,431 heifers that were dead, heifers that calved in 2015 that were dead in 2016. There was 9,517 heifers that calved in 2015 that didn't have a calf in 2016, and there was 41,000 odd that met the 410 days, and there was 9,000 odd that didn't meet the 410 days. The thing that drew my eye when I did this matrix was the no calf, no calf. So in 2015, there were 81,000 cows that didn't have a calf, that previously calved. Of that, 44,000 didn't have a calf in 2016 either. If you go to 2022, the number is that we had 57,000 that didn't have a calf in 2022. In 2023, the number that didn't have a calf in the second year running had fallen to 25,000. And when you look at the overall numbers, you see there was 456,000 in 2016 and 422,000 in 2022-23 in these numbers. The key is that 30,000 drop in animals, 20,000 has come from no calf, no calf. So a cow that has been unproductive for 2 years in a row. So the industry is making those improvements. In terms of the policy domain, the money for the scheme is ring fenced, and that means that any cow that does not qualify, or any calf that does not qualify because the dam's calving interval from 2025 onwards, it means that the money associated with that animal is not lost out the system. It goes back into the pot, and the other eligible animals get that. So we see uplifts in the payment rates for those animals that achieve 410-day calving interval. And for 2023, my estimates, looking at the data, would be that in the mainland, it would have been £121 for the uplift, which is a 15% uplift. And on the islands, it's the payment rate would jump to £173 per eligible calf on the islands. And then the kind of bit that has nervously been looked at across various different forums where I've been asked to present on calf mortality, and there was discussion and has been discussion behind the scenes in terms of the mortality. What happens if you change retention periods from 30 days and change those thresholds? And the rationale for that was that the profile, there is an abnormal profile of calf mortality in the SSBSS farms compared with dairy. Now, there's lots of different excuses for this, but there does appear to be an unnatural dip before 30 days, and after 31 days, then you start seeing calf mortality levels coming in. So it's just a reminder that the government are actually monitoring these kind of things, and to make sure that people are aware that that I think there's going to be increased scrutiny on that data next year. And I'm going to stop talking there, and probably because I've overrun.
A pleasure to be talking to you tonight. I could talk for hours, as those of you who know me will know. So I will do my best to be brief and do my best not to be perhaps too controversial. Although again, it depends on your viewpoint and your benchmark as to how controversial I could be. But even if you take nothing away from this, apart from this one slide, I think this is really important, because when we talk about sustainability, there is no definitive system, region, herd, flock, whatever it might be. You know, every system can and should be sustainable if we can get the right things in place. And by that, I mean a balance between environmental responsibility, economic viability, and social acceptability, which sounds so easy, doesn't it? You know, just balance these three things, it'll be fine. However, as has been alluded to earlier, to some degree, the goalposts are continually changing. So what was sustainable 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago is not necessarily what is sustainable now, and may not be in the future. So all of these systems, these are all places I've visited over the years, from, you know, goats in New York State on the bottom left to pigs in a university research farm top left to Jersey cows in Australia on the top right. You know, any of these systems can and should be sustainable, but it is a difficult job, and it does mean spilling an awful lot of plates all at the same time. Not least because we face a number of challenges relating to perceptions from consumers, from policymakers, from retailers, you know, and almost everybody else as well. And the first thing that I think is really important to underline, because it gets forgotten a lot, not least sometimes when it comes to policy, is that every single food that we eat, in fact, everything we do, has some environmental impact. And that should be so obvious, but I think it's worth repeating just to underline that. Even if you eat, you know, foraged roadkill, that animal will have had some impact on the environment. And all of these foods, and for those of you who are paying attention, you will note that as I did this slide when I was back in the States, these foods actually go from A to apple, through B for beer, all the way to Z for zucchini. All of these foods have some impact on the environment, and every farming system does as well. So there is no perfect. There is no, you know, if you just have 12 cows, or just have 5,000 cows, if you just feed this feed additive or use this color of tractor, you know, there are always balances, and as I say, the goalposts are continually shifting. And I do love the fact that we can find out almost every bit of information about anything on our phones, on our computers. I do spend too much time on social media, probably. And it's really good for information. But again, as an industry, we face quite a threat. So this is an infographic from an Instagram account called Simple Happy Kitchen. They're very good at what they do. You can see the nice little cartoons there of various foods with gas clouds attached to them. I should point out, as you will all know, the gas clouds from the beef and the sheep at the bottom should be coming from the front rather than the back. But the size of those gas clouds is meant to represent the carbon footprint of all these different foods. I could honestly talk about this slide for about 45 minutes, but as a scientist, the first thing is that really bugs me is that I've got no idea where that data comes from. Is it peer reviewed? Is it scientific? I've got no idea, because there's no citation or reference at the bottom on that Instagram post. The second one is that these are global averages. And as you all know, there is no global beef system. There's no global sheep system. There's no global lentil system even. So for all of us, the carbon footprint of what we eat is no more a global average as our height or our income. And the third issue with this is when you look at all these foods, with the exception of tomatoes, these are all protein-rich foods. And yet the carbon footprint here is expressed in kilos of carbon per 1,000 calories. So to the consumer, and bearing in mind the huge proportion of people that don't have any background or understanding in animal agriculture, to the consumer, it seems really clear, doesn't it? You know, if you want a low carbon diet, you should eat, let's say, beans, tofu, and lentils. But that is a very narrow picture, as I say, no citations, possibly the wrong metric when we're talking about protein-rich foods and talking about calories, but also that's only talking about carbon. That's not talking about all of the other advantages that ruminant livestock bring to our lives and to the planet. So the question is, what can we do, both from a practical point of view and a sort of high-level point of view? Well, and this is a bit of a cliche, obviously, honesty is the best policy, but, you know, we need to be more honest. We need to be more transparent. We do have as an industry, sometimes have a tendency to sort of go, oh, look, it's all beautiful. You know, every beef animal is in a lovely pasture with lots of buttercups. You know, look at the lovely flowers. Everything's wonderful. You know, we do need to be more honest, more transparent about what goes on farms, and have some, I guess, accountability would be quite a good word. You know, we tend to shy away from conversations. We tend to not want to engage, which is completely understandable. I mean, I honestly think my Twitter um feed is either very happy people or very angry people, and most of the very angry people are angry with me for eating meat and dairy, for example. But we need to be more honest and more transparent, and part of that means that we need more data and we need more information, because it's really difficult to talk about the positive things that we're doing if we don't have the data. So when we look at carbon footprints, for example, this was some really nice data, came out in 2022. You've got the reference there at the bottom, obviously. And it was looking at the emissions intensity, so the kilos of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilo of product, so beef or lamb, in various different systems in Scotland. So we've got lowland cattle and sheep, severely disadvantaged area cattle, severely disadvantaged area cattle and sheep, and severely disadvantaged area sheep. And my point here is, look at the variation. You know, I haven't even put bars on the lowest values on the lowest bars, because they're so tiny. But you can basically see, if we just look at lowland cattle and sheep, which is the left-hand one, the lowest value is about 1 kilo of carbon per kilo of product. The highest is 52. If we go all the way to the right-hand side for SDA sheep, again, the lowest value is about 2. The highest is 205. And I've put that arrow there because if that bar actually gets as high as 205, everything else just looks so small you can't even see the graph. You know, so there's massive variation. Obviously, this is specific to Scotland, but to be fair, we see the same variation across the UK, across regions, across the world. This is not exclusive to Scotland. Whenever we look at carbon footprints, we see massive variation. So just to illustrate that, here's some data for the UK as a whole. As was alluded to earlier, my role at Harper Adams, which is half of my time, is the ABP chair of Sustainable Beef and Sheep Production. We've been doing a carbon footprinting project, footprinting 352 farms across the UK, all the way from Orkney to the Isle of Wight, range of systems, all beef or sheep, or beef and sheep. So we've got more beef and sheep than either of the other two categories. But here we're just looking at beef. And again, you can see the massive variation. So you've got the number of farms on the left-hand side. So, for example, you can see we've got about 5 farms with a carbon footprint of less than 10 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilo of dead weight, all the way to the right-hand side where it's greater than 55 kilos. You know, so huge variation across the UK, across farms, across systems. Part of the reason we've done this programme, obviously ABP have a bit of a vested interest in knowing the carbon footprint of their supply chain, but the other reason is we don't have a good benchmark for UK carbon footprints of beef and sheep. We tend to rely on old data based on Ebleck's work from about 2009, or the Poor and Nemechek Oxford University data, which I'm sure you've all seen. It gets quoted on the BBC almost constantly and has some flaws. I'll just put it as simply as that. But of course, this is just beef. You know, beef is beef is beef on this one. So if we drill down a little bit more, again, the same data, looking at the entire PRISM database, but just for beef systems. So these are farms that have beef. So it could be beef only farms or beef and sheep farms, but we're only looking at the beef. And again, you can see that the sucklers have a carbon footprint there of about 32 and 31 compared to the beef bred and continental finishes and the dairy bred finishes, which are lower at about 23 and 22 kilos of carbon per kilo of dead weight. Massive caveat here that I always feel compelled to point out, and it should be obvious to all of us, but of course, yes, the finishers have a lower carbon footprint, but that's partly because they don't have to maintain any suckler cows on their operation. So what we are going to do with this data for the finishers only is we're going to have to do some accounting for the fact that those calves came from somewhere. And dairy beef almost always has a low carbon footprint, but that's of course because the carbon footprint of the dam is allocated back to dairy rather than to beef. And so we really do need some better accounting to take account of that. And I'll come on to that in just a second. So what have we learned from this program? Well, when we're looking at cutting the carbon footprint, and we've made recommendations to every single farm on a bespoke basis, reports have gone out to them with grants available as well to facilitate some of these changes. And then we're footprinting again after 2 years to see what changes there have been. But there's always opportunities, anything that improves productivity, that improves the key performance indicators, from the simple to the complex. So for example, improving animal productivity, optimizing fertilizer use. We saw a lot of farms in the first round who had come away from fertilizer use because it was when fertilizer was really, really expensive about 2 years ago now. It'll be interesting to see how their footprints change, because quite a lot have come back to using some fertilizer, which will obviously have an increase in the carbon footprint, but of course will potentially have some positive impacts on soil fertility. Been a lot of interest in using multi-species swards, rotational grazing, but one of the key things that we've said to almost everybody is just monitoring performance and data. We know that only about 50% of farmers weigh their livestock. If we don't weigh them, we don't condition score them. How do we know how they're growing? How do we know the best time for them to go onto slaughter? So it isn't rocket science, honestly. I'm not going to say there's this magical thing you can do that will solve all the problems. It isn't rocket science. Feed additives at the bottom there, definitely an option. Of course, at the moment, issues getting them into suckler cattle as opposed to cattle housed and or fed TMR, and that is going to, if that comes across, that could be a real bonus. But there is some questions about what that does in terms of changing in performance, which in dairy it doesn't seem to have an impact, but also potentially wider impacts on, for example, ecosystems and biodiversity. And as I've said, I could talk for hours. I've got PowerPoint slides on almost everything. But I'm well aware that as an academic, after a while, people start switching off, and she's there with a PowerPoint. And what I have learned is the best thing is to learn from each other. What worked on my farm was this. I tried this, but that didn't work, but it was really good on his or her farm, So it isn't just about academics like me saying this is what you should do. Part of this is about discussion groups, farm walks, farmers talking to farmers, and we're taking that further with this Sustainable Farm Network at Harper Adams at the moment. Because of course what works on one farm, and of course I had to have the classic Highland cow in here, doesn't work on another farm. So we've got grazing based operation here, we've got a stabilizer operation here in Yorkshire, and then compared, for example, to some Jersey cross British blue calves in a finishing operation in Shropshire here. So we don't, even though we've got the same basic opportunities, improve productivity, do everything better, better health, better welfare, better feed choice, better pasture. Exactly how that's done will vary farm on farm on farm. And you are obviously better placed in knowing what works on your farm than me or anybody else. But this is such a challenge because, yes, we've got government policy, but we've also got retailer policy. And I honestly think that in future, we're going to see more and more labels like this because, pardon the pun, consumers are hungry for information. They may not understand it. They may not know what they want, but they want more information on how we produce food, what we do, on water footprints, antibiotic footprints, all of the things that we should be measuring. And that's why we need the data to prove what we're doing, to show that we're doing a good job. Because if we can't back it up with data, unfortunately, that isn't going to end well. And certainly from a retailer and a processor point of view, there's been a lot of promises, there's been a lot of programs, there's been a lot of initiatives to, cut the carbon footprint of the food supply chain by X. This one from RAP, for example, a 50% reduction in food-related greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And of course, that's going to come down to the producer. So it's about better communication, better understanding of what we can do on farm to make that change all the way across the supply chain. And I talked about suckler cows earlier, and I do have an honest concern, really, that if I was a retailer or if I was a processor, the carbon footprint of dairy beef is roughly half to 2/3 of that of suckler beef. So if I'm thinking, what do I do about my scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, which are the ones that come from the producers in the chain, I can see that dairy beef could be the answer. Now, please don't think that I'm knocking dairy beef here. I'm not at all. But that means we've got to work even harder to help people understand the positives of the suckler cow. Because, and I'm such a data nerd, but from an annual basis, calculated out, a suckler cow is going to consume about 4,000 kilos of feed, dry matter. And I say feed, obviously, primarily pasture. She's going to consume just over 20,000 litres of water, and she's going to produce just under 2.5 tons of carbon dioxide in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. So it is something we're going to have to justify, basically, because the suckler cow is a brilliant, brilliant beast. We've just got to keep her around. But again, we've got so much pressure, and I'm sure many of you have seen the articles by Georges Monbiot in The Guardian. I used to love their crossword. I can't even read it anymore. It makes me so cross because I see things like this, when foodies, celebrity chefs, and even some environmentalists say we should eat pasture-fed or grass-fed meat. This is what it means in practice. Most damaging of all food products, it cannot feed more than a tiny number without causing ecocide. We've got to communicate better just how important grazing ruminants are and get past all of the rhetoric. We have to help people understand that if you've got a suckler cow in Galloway, that doesn't mean that rainforests are being cut down. We've got to communicate better. And particularly the fact that most people do not understand that we can't grow human food crops everywhere. It's a lovely image that you can grow an apple tree or kale or quinoa on every single hectare, but of course we can't. But again, a complicated message, but some really nice work came out from Mike Wilkinson about 10 years ago. He looked at feed efficiency. Even in things like The Guardian, they often say, well, if you've got to eat meat, you should eat pork and poultry because it's more efficient. Well, if we look at the quantity of human edible protein going into ruminant diets versus pork and poultry diets, we actually see that dairy cattle and suckler beef produce more human edible protein than they ever consume. So in an efficient grazing ruminant system, we do not have the competition with human food that's often cited. And so finally, the other thing that I don't have the expertise to talk about, honestly, but I just marvel at is the mighty dung beetle. And to put it very simply, if we cut cattle numbers, we don't have dung. If we don't have dung, we don't have the dung beetle. If we don't have the dung beetle, they can't do all the marvelous things that they do for soil quality, for productivity, for reducing parasites in cattle at a saving of approximately £367 million per year to UK cattle farmers. But also the dung beetles, their larvae, as you will all know, nourish ground nesting birds. So if we take off the cattle, we have no dung beetles, we have no dung, and we have no ground nesting birds because the pasture also gets too high to support their nesting. So it's a huge topic, and it's a wide topic, and we've got to help everybody understand the nuances of this massive, massive topic, which is a huge challenge. But ultimately, it comes back to something very, very simple, that ruminants are really important for soil health. And ultimately, with the exception of the fish pie on the right-hand side here, although it does have potatoes on top, so it still counts, almost all of our food comes from the soil. So we've got to do everything we can to nourish healthy soil, and grazing ruminants are a really, really big part of that. And I feel like I'm a politician now. Grazing ruminants, grazing ruminants. But I really feel passionately about that. So I'm going to stop talking now, hoping I haven't gone too much over time. And yeah, really looking forward to debate and discussion.
Oh yeah, thank you very much, Jude. There's a lot of food for thought, a lot of potential conversation or topics to go at. What I wondered, Stevie, do you want to? I hope Stevie's still with us. To be fair, hopefully we get him back. The first question, I suppose. In fact, I'm going to go to you, Stevie. Any thoughts on what Jude was saying? Anything particularly springs to mind, or anything you want to?
No, I mean,
question?
it's what it's like there's a proverbial we in here. There's a group of us that seem to get dragged into a lot of these policy discussions, and what Jude's talking about is the same discussions we try and have with politicians, with policymakers, where there quite often isn't the full understanding of the topic that they're discussing. We have to remember that policymakers are moved around within government. And they don't have the expertise, they don't have years of experience, and they sometimes get parachuted in and they must think, what the heck have I landed on? And one of the discussions is quite often about human edible, what human edible calories. I mean, I keep saying calories are so 1970s, and we should be talking about nutrition and density of nutrition. That kind of conversation is happening all the time. Alongside if you remove livestock, then what do you have on the ground? And I keep looking at some of these areas where I'm seeing rewilding, retreeing, or natural regeneration, where all of the herbivores are moved off the land. Deer are all shot. There's no herbivores, there's no crap in the land, there's no dung beetles, there's no nature, there's very little in terms of the biodiversity that everybody seems to crave, because we've moved the herbivores off the system. And it's re-emphasizing those messages is vital as we move to an unring-fenced agricultural support mechanism or support pots, and explaining what happens on the ground if you move farmers off the land, if farmers abandon the activity on the land. It's actually detrimental to everything that the Scottish Government and Welsh Government, Northern Irish Government, English Government are actually looking for. And it's trying to hit those messages home is vital. And that whole density, the nutrient density element, and what's coming down the track on the private sector scale scares the living daylights out of me. The great thing for Scotland, though, is we've got tons of water. We've got tons of water, so embedded water shouldn't really be a problem. Plus, we've got loads of grass and rough grazing, which we can't really use for much else at this moment in time. So, there is future here, and we're already seeing English processors and finishers come into Scotland to buy livestock, because the changes that we're seeing south of the border are a warning for us all.
Yeah. I think you've coined a phrase there now, retreeing is now going to be, we're going to embed that in the language. It's like a good way of putting it, certainly in this context. I hope that's the message, and I think that's the message we're getting clearly. I was at the SOPA conference today. Jim Fairley was speaking, and he pretty much said what you just said about the value, the need for grazing livestock in our country, to keep our country the way it is, or improve the way that our country is. So it's one, I think often, we spoke about it yesterday, but I think where we hear the story that cows are killing the planet, if we ignore George Monbiot and the extreme end of things, where I hear it most is actually farmers saying that we're not. We by defending it so much, we can be too defensive, and actually we need to get, I think, much better at telling there's so many good news stories out there too, and there's also a good news story of progress. Jude, you showed that really well, and in fact, Stevie also, we have made progress over time. There is, and whether that was deliberate or whether it's reductions in numbers and things, there's a lot happening. But we do have a good news story to talk about too. So I wonder if we're shouting about the negatives too much and actually should spend more time and effort focusing on the positives. Would that be reasonable, Jude?
I think the other thing is it's really easy and I feel this just as much as everybody else, to feel like the whole world's against us. Everyone's going plant-based. No one's eating beef. No one's eating that, blah, 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 blah. And then I actually go into a shop, for example, and go, wow, it's actually still, a massive meat case, huge amounts of beef and lamb and bacon and everything else. You go to a restaurant and there's 2 vegetarian options, maybe 3, depending where you go. So I think we can become very despondent and very, everyone's turning vegan, for example, and they're really not. It's still a really small proportion of people. They've just got really loud voices in quite a lot of cases. And the supermarkets, for example, and you go in on the 1st of January, A, the cream eggs are in there, which is fabulous because I love a cream egg. But B, it's all about go plant-based this January, try vegan, be healthy, etc., etc. But that's disappeared by about the 10th of January. And everyone's back to eating bacon, for example. So, I mean, yeah, I think we do have to take some positives from just the amount of people who haven't gone plant-based, or even when people have gone flexitarian, which is defined as making a conscious decision to eat less meat. That often seems to mean, I take my brother as an example, they live down near London. And he'll often say to me, oh, we found these amazing vegan hot dogs last week and we had some with our bacon and eggs for Sunday morning breakfast. And I'm like, that's the point. It's about diversity of diets, not just cutting out all of the animal proteins. I do wonder whether the veganuary sort of bubble has burst a little bit. This year has been very quiet compared to previous years. And I think people are genuinely more interested in positive stories about food, seeing farms in action, seeing as I say, we have to be careful that we don't paint the picture of everything's happy and sunny and everything's in a beautiful pasture all the time, but people are genuinely interested in food and farming, and we have to use that. But how we leverage it to get past all the ranty people, I'm not sure. And if I did know, I'd be doing a far better job than I am now.
We got a really good tour yesterday around as part of that visit to Easter Howgate. We got a tour around the green sheds. So we saw the big methane chamber, the biodigester, and then we saw the polytunnel, which had just harvested 2 tons of lettuce produced in a closed loop cycle, entirely produced by suckler cows, unavailable to be fed to vegans. I think it's fantastic. We've produced a meat-eating lettuce, which is exciting, but tongue in cheek. The dairy is interesting, so I wanted to throw the dairy in there. So we hear a lot about dairy beef, and we see there's huge progress in terms of yield and efficiency in the dairy sector and in the carbon part of the dairy sector. My observation from working with my dairy clients is there's less of them. There's less, on the whole, there's less dairy cows and there's more litres. So is there any more room in the dairy sector to produce much more beef, or are we going to need the suckler beef to top that up? Stevie or Jude?
Well, again, looking at the data. So one of the things that we've done in the cattle tracing data is based on typologies. We kind of know the dairy farms, and we kind of know what is dairy beef, where the beef is coming from, and when you look at the throughput, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head. I think output from the dairy sector, from 16-17, has increased by about 40,000 calves in that period in Scotland. So we're actually seeing that output. I can now follow a calf that was born on a dairy farm in 2015. I can follow all the way through its life. So I can actually start seeing what is coming in from the dairy sector. So that's fine. But there's only so much demand for dairy products, and if the demand for the dairy product, that's the principal product, if the demand isn't there, then you're not going to get any dairy beef. So the strength of the demand for dairy products is the critical point there. And it's a very specialist. It's a bit like beef finishing. It's there's highly specialized businesses here that are doing it, and I think people have forgotten how how concentrated certain sectors of agriculture are, yet our beef system, because of the stratified nature, and we've got all of these smaller producers around the country, we tend to forget the economic impact, the community impact, the supply chain impacts, and supporting other businesses that are input suppliers, as well as the downstream suppliers and the shops, the whatever. We tend to forget about these, and quite often in my policy discussions, I'm sitting there going, aye, okay, carbon's one thing, nature's another thing, but you're forgetting about the people, the economies, and the original rationale for agricultural support, which was to make sure that we have food production and food at relatively affordable levels. And you could argue that in this country, our food prices are too low. And we've historically managed to keep them low because of A, trade policy, but B, continued agricultural support. So yeah, I think there's scope for dairy, and you're seeing a higher proportion of the English system coming from dairy beef, but that's because of the decline in upland beef, suckler beef systems there. And you could go down the route where you're like Southern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, where literally the government are having to make decisions as to, do you continue supporting dairy, or do you jettison the beef sector in order to reduce emissions? And that was a discussion they had only 2 years ago, was how do they reduce the cattle emissions? And they chose that dairy trumped the beef sector, but they've got global presence in the dairy market. We don't.
Yeah. And I think, as you said, Stevie, you're close to Scottish Government, helping, advising, not designing policy, but those conversations aren't, we're at a different stage. We're not having that depth of conversation. Our issue is very different to what the Republic of Ireland issue is. So I hope we're certainly never going to see that jettisoning over.
There's a couple of questions in the.
Yeah. I was just coming to them. Don't worry.
Just in case everybody thought that you'd forgotten about them.
Yeah, no. So the first question, to be fair, is about embedded emissions and things. And I think rather than going into that in too much detail, I think I'd rather actually answer that question properly by going to the right, the agriculture people, getting the right answer and emailing it to everyone. And I mean that to everyone that's on, because I think I would rather we got that one right rather than go down a rabbit hole of what might be the case or whatever. So I'm not fobbing it off, but we'll certainly come back to it. But the second question, probably similar, and we'll go to Jude on this one, is how do we get a common and fully understandable consistency in measurement? So how do we use the same yardstick? We've got different tools, we've got different units of measurement and things. How do we come to a point where we're actually comparing apples with apples?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. This is absolutely one of my bugbears. I mean, I've done the exercise, as I'm sure many of you have, I'll put a farmer's data into 4 different calculators and get 4 wildly different answers. And even when they're all based on consistent methodology, the data entry, it's all very, very different. I mean, I can also see from the prism, not prison, farms that we look at, I'll see 2 farms that look identical, really, very similar, and their footprints will be completely different. And I'm like, how, when they've got the same number of cows, same basic pasture, roughly the same fertilizer, et cetera, it is a real problem. I mean, we had the report from DEFRA looking at trying to explain the differences between them, and I know there was an announcement, and I'm going to get them wrong because I normally do when I have to think about things, but I think it was AgriCalc, Cool Farm Tool, and Farm Carbon Toolkit. I think that's right. We're going to standardize between the 3, but that sort of made me think, and I may be being cynical, I mean, I normally am, to be fair, that if they standardize too much, they're all going to end up as the same tool. So I did wonder how they would remain competitive, or whatever the word would be, if they literally standardized. But yeah, we need one tool, and ideally, honestly, we need one that works across the globe as well, not just for the UK, let's say. Really tricky, because everybody does it a bit differently, but then everyone puts data in differently as well, so it's not just what the calculator does or what the tools do, it's also having consistency in data entry. And I think maybe one of the only ways to do that would be like they've done it in Ireland with the board beer ones, where it pulls data from lots of different apps, rather than the farmer having to go in and again put, age at first calving or lambing rate or whatever it might be. That might help address it if it can pull the data from other things. But yeah, it really is one of my bugbears.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with HCC, which is the QMS of Wales, and the person there was telling me how Welsh lamb and beef was the lowest carbon footprint in the world. And I'm like, I can't believe that number. And of course, they went to the Oxford database for that. So, the lack of data and the quality of the data is really astoundingly poor in when we're talking about these things. And to answer Hugh's question on that, and also a bit on the anonymous one, which was first, Treasury have been looking at, and the last time I spoke to the lead on agriculture, there was discussion on carbon border tax, and the idea behind a carbon border tax is the normalization of production carbon, basically emissions from agriculture. My concern is, like, if we offshore food production, and regardless of what everybody says about beef production or sheep meat production, the trend is upward. We're consuming more of the blooming stuff globally and at home in UK terms. We're still a huge net importer of beef into this country. Why should we be offshoring those emissions to other countries? And why should we be offshoring potential antibiotic use, potential embedded water issues from drought countries, and potential labour exploitation issues, potential pesticide issues, potential. It's not just about carbon, it's about all of these other things. And then we also lose the opportunity, the economic opportunity to add value to product, to create these foundation industries, which other industries can build on. So there's all of those things that we need to consider that people don't when they become so micro-focused on carbon. And the whole thing on the carbon tools, I mean, the standardization of them is one thing, but the thing that gets me is that the government aren't interested in that, because they deal with this thing called the national inventory. Any imports, so your fertilizers that import, they don't care. It doesn't account. It doesn't come off their account. Your tractors, the embedded carbon in tractors, it doesn't count, because that's all in some other country's profile. And that's the big concern I have, is that we're a ruminant livestock export country, where we have got these emissions associated with beef and lamb, etc. Yet it's actually, we should all be doing this on consumption. It's consumer tax or consumer changed behaviour is what they really need to be driving at. And the CCC, the Committee on Climate Change, will continually saying that we need to reduce beef consumption or red meat consumption by 30%. Like, how are they going to do that? When is this going to happen? Because that's been the narrative for the last decade and a half.
There's a lot to go at, and I'm conscious we could probably do with another 2 hours on this one, because I think we're just getting going. There's a couple of points here on. So one is basically about global warming potential rather than climate change impact. So basically, I suppose it's a GWP 100 versus GWP star question. Jude, have you got any thoughts on whether we change the goalposts a bit to help suit?
Yeah, so
to suit our needs.
GWP star could be a real game changer, because it takes account of the fact that methane breaks down in the atmosphere. Two things on that, really. The IPCC, who are sort of in charge of the methodologies and the metrics that we use, have recognized that it's the right science. The problem is that when we as a nation, or indeed any of the nations, have to report in terms of the Paris Agreement, that's always going to be GWP 100. GWP star isn't an easy one to do. To do it accurately, you've got to go back 20 years, look at livestock numbers, look at emissions. Unfortunately, for a good producer who's got better and has increased their herd, for example, GWP star isn't going to be a good news story, because it'll be like, well, you had 100 cows 20 years ago and now you've got 200 and you're much better. So actually, you know, your carbon footprint as a whole has gone up. So for a region or an industry, it's generally going to be positive. For individual farms, it's not always going to be a good news story, but I genuinely think that will focus us more onto nitrous oxide, which has a higher potential, no matter whether we're talking about GWP star or GWP 100. It's roughly 300 compared to roughly 25 for methane. So it's going to focus us far more on manure and fertilizer use, which I think will give us some really good benefits. So upshot is we're going to have to keep reporting in GWP 100, but possibly GWP star as well. And I know some of the calculators, including AgriCalc, are looking at trying to incorporate GWP star.
Can I just come in on that as well, Robert? Is that it's actually useful, and the chair of the international panels now is Scotsman. He's born in Dundee, and Jim is an advocate for GWP star, actually, which is good. The problem with GWP star is it means that methane becomes a policy priority, because by reducing methane, you can net cooling. You don't get cooling, but you rapidly decrease the global warming, so it becomes a target. And that's the real risk here. Is they target livestock methane emissions from livestock, rather than going after where the big issues are, which is from oil and gas sector, where the amount of methane that's coming out of there, and you can see it from space in these global plumes. That's the big risk, and that's the risk, and it comes right back to what Jude was saying. Is as an individual farmer, I really detest this whole process of carbon footing farmer A against farmer B, and actually thinking, well, which one's best. Like farmer B might have a larger footprint because on GWP star because they're expanding, but they might be far more technically efficient, and actually in the real terms, they're the food producers of the future. Why would we stymie them? We have to look at this in the round. It's global climate change. It's not looking at the lens of a farm. The tools are useful for it, so people can do comparative studies to see where they could make changes, but we shouldn't be using them as policy tools, personally.
Yeah, excellent. I'm just, as I said, conscious of time. There's one point here about how do we actually market the positive, if we believe that we've got a positive environmental story to tell, how do we actually market that on the menu? I think, personally, I'm going to answer this one, is do we go down the route of saying carbon efficient beef on the menu, or do we go down the route of saying naturally reared, tell the rest of the story? This is the bit of the story that's hard to explain. There's some of the rest of it is so straightforward. Tell them where it's from, what it was, go down that road of things that we absolutely know inside out. And that consumer's partly interested in the carbon thing. They're really interested in the rest of it too. So maybe we just focus on the bit that we can guarantee we're right, and tell the interesting story, that the biodiversity story or whatever it is. Let's go after the good stuff. And there's another comment I just want to finish on, really, is somebody has said, they're anonymous. It's a real shame, because they've said this webinar is just so valuable. Thank you. So whoever you are, you're very welcome. What I'm going to do, I just want to share my screen just for a quick second. This is obviously a series, so we have more to come. So today we probably have we've certainly done the carbon thing. What's the problem? Where are we at just now? Hopefully it's a positive conclusion. Certainly, Stevie and Jude, I think you've done an outstanding job tonight of making what can sometimes be a very boring topic into something that's actually quite interesting and brought to life.